Good afternoon, good evening, everybody. My name is Sama Bilbao León. I am Director General of World Nuclear Association, and it is a pleasure to welcome all of you to this joint webinar on enabling sustainable development through the system of radiological protection, jointly organized by the International Council of Radiological Protection and World Nuclear Association. I want to start by thanking the ICRP Secretariat and also the ICRP Commission members, and of course the members of the Association's Radiological Protection Working Group for their excellent cooperation and support in organizing this joint webinar. And again, I also want to express my gratitude to all the other presenters and all the other organizations, and of course all of you, the participants, for being here today. Nuclear energy, as you know, provides the abundant, affordable, 24/7 clean energy that is needed to meet the world's growing energy demands, while of course fulfilling the climate change objectives of the Paris Agreement in a cost-effective and equitable manner. So this is very important. It is going to help us meet our sustainable development goal of affordable and clean energy, and also the other one about combating climate change. But the reality is nuclear technologies do so much more. The planet and humanity are much better off because of the many nuclear contributions to achieve each and every one of the 17 United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. As you probably know, last year at COP28, we had 25 countries that boldly committed to work together to advance a global goal of tripling global nuclear capacity by 2050. And just last week at New York Climate Week, we have 14 major global banks and financial institutions that seconded this goal and pledged their financial support to that. But let's just be clear. Nuclear science and technology also helps, for example, with Sustainable Development Goal #1, because nuclear technology helps reduce poverty and stimulates economic growth. And nuclear techniques help reduce pests and develop better crops, reducing hunger, that is Sustainable Development Goal #2. Or of course, nuclear medicine and medical radioisotopes, and all these nuclear technology techniques are contributing to better health and better stability of life, which of course is Sustainable Development Goal #3. And I could go on talking about quality education, gender equality, clean water, industrialization. So I think that nuclear energy and nuclear science and technology in general is essential to meet all 17 Sustainable Development Goals. So the development of all these exciting nuclear technologies and also the promotion of this growth and prosperity is going to really need, yes, innovation, yes, technology, but also we are going to need to have efficient, balanced, and effective regulations, including, of course, the regulations related to radiological protection. So this is what we are trying to discuss in this webinar, how to balance the very important goal to achieving the appropriate level of protection against the not so good effects of ionizing radiation, while unduly limiting the benefits associated with the use of all this ionizing radiation. So, because I really think that is very important, that if the system of radiological protection that we are using is not balanced, there is a risk that we will actually unduly limit the benefits that nuclear energy and all these nuclear science and technology techniques contribute. We may not have the full rewards of this. So, for example, if we have too much emphasis on minimization radiation exposures to levels that are well below natural background radiation, it could significantly limit the benefits to the construction of new nuclear facilities or the life extension of existing plants in the context of the current global climate emergency. So for this, I really think that exclusively focusing on the radiation risk associated with very low exposure levels can distract organizations and can divert some resources away from other higher risk areas, while at the same time reinforcing the view that nuclear radiation is particularly harmful, when in reality, we should really be promoting an all hazards approach when assessing the workplace and public health hazards and safety risks. So I think that many of you know that the ICRP has initiated a process for the review of the system of radiological protection, which is really likely to lead to a new set of general recommendations. So this process will shape radiation-related policies, practice, guidelines, and regulations around the world in the decades to come. And of course, the outcome of this process could have enormous impact, not only for the nuclear industry, but in reality for any industry and nuclear technology sector that uses ionizing radiation. So this is why it's very, very important to appropriately ensure due consideration to the practicality and the proportionality when we are looking at making any changes in the system for radiological protection. And also to ensure that the expertise and the know-how and the daily perspectives of using ionizing radiation in the industry is actually considered when we move forward setting the new radiological protection standards, because obviously they will have global implications for not only the nuclear and nuclear technology sectors, but really for the humanity and the planet. So in this webinar, we will provide an excellent opportunity to explore a number of key topics, which will play an important part in the review and revision of the system of radiological protection, and of course, in enabling sustainable development, such as the COP28 ambition of tripling global nuclear capacity. So for the next few minutes, we will have 10 speakers that are coming from both the International Commission of Radiological Protection Commission and also from the industry to bring forward the different views and perspectives and to discuss and to have a conversation. So we will talk about the future of the radiological protection profession and how we are going to triple radiological protection workforce capabilities. We will discuss how to make better decisions when we are looking at very low dose exposures. We will exchange our views regarding the proposed changes in dose and dose rate effectiveness factors at low dose. We will discuss the importance of individual sensitivity within the context of well-established industries such as the nuclear industry. And we will discuss the role of the ICRP and the system of radiological protection in the context of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, including, of course, output of the recent United Kingdom Society for Radiological Protection workshop. So the last part of the seminar will be a panel conversation, a panel discussion that will be managed and moderated by my colleague, Sameh Melhem, who is the program lead for radiological protection at World Nuclear Association. And of course, we will have the 10 speakers that we will have in the first part of the moderator, as well as the International Atomic Energy Agency section head on waste and environmental safety, Anna Clark. So I think that we will have a very, very spirited and dynamic conversation about all these topics. So I want to end my introductory remarks, but giving you some practical details. So please note that only the invited speakers are going to be able to actually speak, be heard by all the others that are participating in the panel. So all others, all of you participants, unfortunately are muted. However, there is an opportunity for each and every one of you in the audience to contribute and ask questions. So for that, I ask you to use the Q&A box that is at the bottom of your screen to pose questions to the speakers and the panels. So we will do our best to answer the questions, as many as possible. Some of them will be answered by typing them in the chat, but some of them will be answered live by the appropriate speaker. So let me just close by again, thank you all the speakers, thank you the organizers, and thank you all of you for participating. And now I am going to turn this over to Werner Rühm, who leads the staff unit Future of Radiological Protection at the Federal Office of Radiation Protection in Germany. And of course, Werner is currently the chair of the ICRP Commission. So Werner will provide the ICRP opening remarks and briefly talk about the ICRP review process and the RCIP, the radiological protection system, in a way to set the scene for the rest of the webinar conversations. So I turn it over to you, Werner, and thank you everybody for inviting me to join you for this important webinar. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sama, for introducing me. And indeed, I would like to take the opportunity to very briefly introduce ICRP and our big project at the moment. And for this, I would like to share my screen. So very briefly, because Sama already said much, I just want to remind you that ICRP was founded in 1926 and became the International Commission on Radiological Protection actually in 1950. ICRP is a charity, and very importantly, ICRP is an independent organization in terms of that it is an independent non-governmental organization, an NGO. Our mission is that we want to harmonize radiological protection by developing sensible recommendations, so only recommendations. The system as developed by ICRP is the basis of standards, regulations, guidance, and practice everywhere, all over the world. And with this, we would like to protect patients, workers, the public, and also the environment against, as Sama already mentioned, against the detrimental effects of radiation exposure all over the world and even beyond in space. But at the same time, we really do not want to unduly limit the benefits associated with the use of ionizing radiation. And there are many benefits, many occasions where we benefit from the use of ionizing radiation. Just think of radiotherapy, imaging, and so on and so forth. This is our membership. We try to have recruit our membership from all over the world. Currently, we have more than 400 members from more than 50 countries. And this is our structure. We have the main commission as the deciding body of ICRP, supported by the scientific secretariat. And we have the scientific secretary, Clement, with us today in our seminar. And then we have 4 standing committees: Committee 1 on radiation effects, Committee 2 on dosimetry, Committee 3 on medical applications of ionizing radiation, and finally, Committee 4 on the application of the system. And 2 of those committees, the chairs of 2 of those committees are with us: Dominique Laurier, chair of Committee 1, and Thierry Schneider, chair of Committee 4. Now, under each of the tasks, the committees, there are task groups, and I will come to them in a minute. We have international relationships. We have currently with 35 organizations formal relations. And this is the list. You will find the list and details on our website. And this is ordered alphabetically. So at the very last, at the bottom on the right, not least, is the World Nuclear Association, WNA, with whom we are organizing this webinar. Thanks for that. Now, 2 minutes on our big project at the moment. We are currently in the process to review and revise the system of radiological protection. And this is quite a way to go. We started in the orange area down here to identify topics. We call them building blocks, which are important for this review. And then we develop those building blocks. We review them by establishing task groups and let the task groups work on those topics. And finally, hopefully we will reach the summit and prepare the next general recommendations using those building blocks. How did we do that? Well, we initiated the process and tried to stimulate an international discussion by publication of 2 open access papers, which summarize the view of the ICRP main commission on that. And we invited, in both papers, we invited the community to contribute, to participate in the discussion and to do this review and revision together with us. So those 2 papers summarize the view of ICRP, and the other 2 papers here on the bottom, they summarize the feedback we got. So the discussion, we stimulated discussion and we got feedback from many international organizations, including, of course, WNA. And again, you can read those papers if you are interested to see or to read what the community, the international community thought about the initial ideas of ICRP. So where are we now? Well, currently, we believe that we have already identified most of the important topics together with the community. So we have, in a way, finished phase 1, although we still continue to listen if someone has a good idea. And we are currently in the light blue phase to develop those building blocks through our task groups. So we are now here in the second phase. These are the task groups. Currently, we have 30 active task groups. That's an all-time high. We had never more task groups, and this is thanks to due to the revision of the system, which means a lot of work. And there are new task groups to come next year, I guess. And we will announce this on the website, and we will ask for membership. And then finally, the membership is identified through open calls. And if you go through the topics of the task groups, you will immediately see what the building blocks are we have identified. And let me just mention task group 111 on the left side here, individual response to radiation. And task group 128, the last one on the right, individualization and stratification. And I mentioned those 2 because the chair of both task groups, Simon Bouffler, is also with us today and joins us in our discussions. And with this, I would like to thank you for letting me introducing ICRP. I wish us all a very, very fruitful, interesting webinar. And thanks again for WNA to organizing this together with us. Thank you. Now I will stop this and I will now continue introducing to you our moderator. Our moderator is Sami Melem. He is the Radiological Protection Program Lead at World Nuclear Association. He holds a master's degree in nuclear plant design from Paris Sud University. Sami worked as a radiation protection specialist for about 12 years in several international and national organizations, including, for example, the IAEA, the European Organization for Nuclear Research, CERN, and the German Atomic Energy Commission. And with this, I would like to hand over to you, Sami. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Werner, for this introduction. And thank you very much, Sama, for excellent opening remarks, and for you, Werner, for excellent introduction of the ICRP review process and setting the scene of the webinar. Now we will have up to 10 presentations from the ICRP and the industry side to talk about different topics, as Sama explained. Just to manage to keep on time and allow some time for the discussion, I would like to kindly ask the presenter to give their presentation up to 5 minutes. And now let's go with the first topic of the webinar on the future of radiation protection profession and tripling the RB workforce capacity. First, we will have a presentation given the ICRP perspective on this topic by Christopher Clement. Christopher Clement is the scientific secretary and the COO of the ICRP. He oversees the daily business of the ICRP, represents the organization worldwide, and he has presented well over 300 invited lectures in more than 40 countries. In addition, he has been a volunteer member of the RPWG Executive Council since 2012, and he is currently serving as RPWG President. So welcome, Chris. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Same. I'm just going to share my screen here. Looks like it's okay. So
Yes.
thanks again for the kind introduction, Same. So on this topic of the future of the RP profession and tripling RP workforce capacity, I'd like to start by mentioning what ICRP does, just as a reminder. Fundamentally, what we do is we develop the system of protection and obviously for the public benefit. This takes into account science, of course, ethical values, and practical experience. And most importantly, it's the foundation for the practice of radiological protection fundamentally. And I stress that because in essence, when it comes to right down to it, radiological protection is a practical exercise. It's making decisions and taking actions to protect people in the environment. So because of this, practicability of the system, in other words, putting it into practice in a reasonable way, is crucial to achieving the aim of the system of protection. And for that, the expertise and capacity of the RP workforce is essential. So although we don't drive, I would say, the expertise and capacity of the RP workforce, it's crucial that we keep this in mind when we're developing the recommendations so that it can support this end goal. And because of this, and because we see some concerns about this around the world, we've called for action worldwide to strengthen expertise in RP. And that's what I'll focus on for the next couple of minutes. In Vancouver, 2 years ago at our international symposium in 2022, we launched or announced the Vancouver Call for Action to Strengthen Expertise in RP Worldwide, and that's what I'll focus on for the next couple of slides. So why did we do this? Because we're concerned about shortage of investments in training, education, research, and infrastructure as well, could compromise society's ability to manage radiation risks. That's not good to start with, but really, what's the problem? So what happens if we don't have the expertise and don't have the capacity to do a good job of radiological protection worldwide? And we see several problems. One, it could lead to unjustified exposures. For instance, if people are not informed well about what hazards are of radiation. And on the other side, it could lead to unwarranted fear of radiation, which can impact physical, mental, and social well-being. So people who are overly worried about radiation. In a more practical sense, we can see that it could unduly limit the potential for research and development in new radiation technologies, for example, for beneficial purposes. So we have healthcare, energy, environment, and many other sectors. And this also would not be good for sustainable development worldwide. In the Vancouver Call for Action, we laid out 5 main points, and they are here summarized. So we have 4 specific types of organizations, one for national governments and funding agencies, where we're calling on them to strengthen resources for RP research that's allocated by governments and international organizations. So focusing on the research side of things. Second, for national research labs and other institutions to launch and sustain long-term research programs. And we put the emphasis on long-term because much of what we really need to know, what we need to learn more about, cannot be uncovered in 1 or 2 or 3 or 5 years. Some of these programs, particularly on low-dose research, for instance, and others as well, require decades of dedicated research. So it's important that there are long-term research programs in place, not just year by year with uncertainty about what's happening next. The third group that we focused on are universities to develop undergraduate and graduate university programs and to make students aware of job opportunities in radiation-related fields. And this is both to attract more people, young people in particular, to radiological protection as a interesting career, but also to train them to a level where they can be productive in radiological protection. And then we had 2 broader calls in our call for action. that apply to everyone, really, including ourselves and all organizations. So to use plain language when interacting with the public and decision makers about radiological protection, it's a complicated subject and we use complicated language, but we have to use simpler language when talking to people who are really trying to understand what we're doing. we have to take that step towards them. And the fifth point is to foster general awareness of the proper uses of radiation and RP through education and training of information multipliers. And here we focus on the idea of information multipliers, leaders in particular areas of society, teachers, and so on. Because, I mean, we as an organization can't do it on our own. No single organization can. We have to find other ways to make this more efficient. So we're not doing this alone by any stretch. One piece of evidence for this is the paper that's referenced here, Support for the Vancouver Call for Action to Strengthen Expertise in RP Worldwide, the Position of Organizations and Formal Relations with ICRP. You saw already, Werner listed the 35 organizations that are in formal relations with ICRP. And of course, we work with many, many other organizations as well in a less formal way. But this representatives of the organizations listed here, I won't go through them all for time reasons, but a long list of representatives from organizations put this paper together. And I just pick out one sentence that I think captures the essence of it, is to declare and emphasize that strengthening the expertise in RP is a collective priority for all of us. And for me, this is crucial. One organization can't do it. We have to be working together to achieve this goal. And finally, just a few additional thoughts. In the Vancouver Call, we speak about universities in terms of educational institutions, but of course it should be obvious that there are others, community colleges, technical schools, that can also and should also have an important part to play in developing expertise and capacity in RP. So it's not just at the university level. Radiological expertise at technician level is also crucial, and that can be gained through other means. Similarly, it's not just up to learning educational institutes. Also, industry and employers should play an important role in training and development and research, and very importantly, general awareness of RP and radiological protection, not just for their staff, but more broadly. And just to note that next year we'll have our next international symposium on the system of radiological protection. In 2025, it'll be held in Abu Dhabi at the beginning of November. And we're considering a session dedicated to progress updates on the Vancouver Call for Action. So it'll be an opportunity for organizations to talk about what they've achieved since we began the call. Hopefully you will be able to attend. And I think that's it for me. Thank you very much, Same.
Thank you very much, Chris. On the same topic, we will have Josip Zek, who will provide the industry perspective. Josip is the health physicist director at MC Master University, providing radiation safety and licensing support for the safe operation of their 10 megawatt research reactor, class 2 facilities, and more than 1,200 individuals that perform radiological work activities under the 40 regulatory licenses using on and off campus. So welcome, Joseph. Please provide your presentation.
Thank you, Same. And so I think as, hold on, I got to present here, 1 second. Thank you. So I think as Same and others have already said here, we can see that nuclear technologies are rapidly expanding. And not just for carbon-free sources of energy, but also to address climate change, develop new radionuclides for use in diagnostic and treatment of medicine. And all of this coupled with a review of the International System of Radiation Protection, which is going to have profound impact on the application and sustainability and success of these technologies. It's clear that we need a new and diverse generation of radiation protection professionals that are required to meet these future needs. And so on this next slide, I know it's a really busy slide, but I want to point out 3 main things here. And, one is that, a lot of work goes into just capturing people to become future radiation protection professionals. I know for myself and for a lot of the people that are on this call, you know, when we probably went to high school, elementary school, even university, working in nuclear may not have been our goal when we got there, right? But somehow along the way, we became interested in this field, right? And so a lot of work goes into actually getting people interested in this field, because it's not always necessarily the first thing that they are thinking about when they enter on this educational journey. And so you can see that's complex, and it involves us getting a lot more engaged in that that process, right? So finding ways to reach students, not just when they're in university, but when they're in high school, when they're in elementary school, teaching them about nuclear technologies, helping them understand at least basic levels of radiation risk, right? So they can understand how these technologies can be used. And then also just showing people how this technology is used, right? I know for a lot of nuclear organizations, you know, they open their doors, they allow people to come in, they explain how these technologies are being used, whether it's for, you know, nuclear power, whether it's a research reactor, whether it's a laboratory, radiopharmaceutical production, whatever it might be. You know, they're showing people how these technologies are not just important because you're, you know, making electricity, but important because of the impact they have on society. From there, you know, we need to, when we do get people interested in this field, we need to find ways to provide them with that knowledge that they require to become RP radiation protection experts. And so, you know, that is part of, you know, an undergraduate program, graduate program, and so on, as that's applicable not only to get people so they can become enter the profession, but also to go to the second part here, which is around gaining radiation protection knowledge and skills, which is allowing people that are already working in the field to get the knowledge they need to become radiation protection experts. And so to do that, you know, organizations have their own training, but we also need to make sure, you know, for myself at an academic institution, you know, make sure that we have courses that people can take that are, you know, remote, that are virtual, that that people that are already working in the field can take in addition to their work, so they can become better radiation protection professionals. And so to give you an example of that, I was teaching a graduate course, you know, a couple of years ago that we do every few years that provides working professionals with a master's in nuclear engineering. And I had a student that was on an oil rig in Saudi Arabia, and I'm teaching this course in Canada, right? And the student had actually another goal, and he wanted to work in another field of nuclear, but after taking the course became interested, and now he's working in a health physicist at one of our nuclear organizations here in Canada, right? So, but just having that available for people to be able to take remotely, people that can take those kind of things while they're working, allows them to further expand their skills. And then when we do get people into this field and they start getting this experience, we need to find ways to retain them and develop them. The reality is that, you know, most of the new generation of workers, they're not like, you know, my father was, where he did the same job for 38 years and he was happy doing that. The new generation doesn't want to do the same job for 38 years, right? And so they want the opportunity to do work, to gain experience, and then to move on to the next thing, and do work, gain experience, and move on to the next thing. And so, you know, we need to find ways to support that development, still get the work that we need to get done, but to support that development of individuals so they can become the RP radiation protection experts that we're going to need to meet the needs of the future. And one of the key things I'm hoping that you recognize in looking at this very busy slide is that, you know, capturing the professional, gaining the RP knowledge and skills, and then retaining and developing them in their career progression is not a quick process. You know, similar to the changes to the general recommendations, this is a process that happens over many years. And so it requires us, if we want to get that next generation of radiation protection professionals, requires us to start that process now, and to you know, get these individuals into the field, support them, and support their progression, so that way we can meet our future needs. And so I'm not going to go through all the things on the next couple slides here, but I do want to point out that, you know, there's a lot of things that we need to do. And one of them specifically is to not just recruit young students, but to recruit existing professionals that are already in the field. Right. So we want to get people maybe that aren't even in radiation protection. Maybe they're working at a coal plant, but they have the right safety understanding of implementing safety programs. And if we can provide them with the radiation protection expertise that they need, that initial training, we can get them into this field. And I think we all have examples of people that we work with. For myself, I've done health physics pretty much from university and onward. But I worked with plenty of people when I joined the nuclear industry that health physics wasn't even an option at a university for them, right? So they came in through different avenues, but they became radiation protection experts. And so we need to make sure that we continue to pull on that string and get people that are already working in the field, that already have that certain applicable education, whether it's in chemistry or engineering, and get them into radiation safety, provide them with the technical radiation safety information they need, and then support their progression. And so, like I said, I don't want to go through everything here. I think I've mentioned a lot of it, but additionally, what we need to do is we need to provide mentorship and fellowship opportunities. We cannot, no organization can do this on their own, right? And so we need to make sure that we are allowing ourselves and allowing our staff to go and participate in conferences, take part in societies, and have accreditation programs and use them as quality gates for moving people through this process. We also need to make sure that we're providing opportunities for students and professionals to gain the experience. And working at an educational institution, I can tell you it's always challenging to see that we are graduating students, and those students are graduating and saying, okay, they're applying for jobs, and all the jobs they're applying for say that the organizations are looking for 5 to 10 years of experience. So you have a student that's ready to enter the field, but they can't get a job because they don't have experience, can't get experience because they don't have a job, and then they're stuck in this race, right? And so ultimately what we need is for organizations to recognize that they need to have some of these junior positions within their organization, so that way they can meet the needs of the future. And so, I'm sorry, I'm running out of time. I'm just going to go to the last slide here and just say that, the future of the radiation protection profession will really depend on all of us, all of the nuclear affiliated organizations to work together to meet this need. And so this works with all of us working to attract individuals, academic institutions, looking at colleges and universities, looking at educating them, developing them, mentoring them through industry and other organizations, and continuing to develop them in this field. And so as we can see in the declaration here during the IRPA 2024 conference, the radiation protection industry pledge is committing to a goal of at least tripling our radiation protection capacity by 2050. So if we want to meet these needs of the nuclear industry as a whole, then we also need to triple our capability and the amount of nuclear professionals that we have and radiation protection professionals that we have to meet that need. And so with that, I'll close that out, and thank you very much for having me here today.
Thank you very much, Joseph. For the attendees, I would like to remind you to use the Q&A function in Zoom to post your questions to the speakers to discuss them during the panel discussion at the end of the webinar. Moving to the second part of the webinar, the second topic on the webinar, on how to make better decision at very low dose exposure, I would like to invite Thierry Schneider to provide the ICRP perspective on this. Thierry is the director of the Nuclear Protection Evaluation Center in France since January 2017. He is currently the chair of the ICRP Committee 4 on the application of the ICRP recommendation. He has been involved in research projects related to the assessment and management of the radiological risk and to the methodological approach for optimization of radiological protection, including societal and ethical issues. So welcome, Thierry, and hand over to you.
Thank you, Sameh, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you. So this is my pleasure to share with you the current reflection of ICRP on how to make better decisions at very low dose exposure. I'm not sure that in 5 minutes I will be able to respond to this question. I will mainly provide some element of reflection which are currently going on within ICRP and together with a large number of international and national organizations. So first of all, this question of what is reasonable, this is some element which is crucial for applying the principle of optimization. We need to evaluate what level of radiation exposure should be considered as low as reasonably achievable in given circumstances. And that means taking into account societal and economic factors, but also environmental factors. And this is interesting to remind you what have been mentioned for this perspective in publication 138 on the ethical foundation of the radiological protection system. In this publication, the reasonableness is mentioned to make rational, informed, and impartial decision that respect other views, goals, and conflicting interests. So this is some element on which we rely for discussing reasonableness. And following the publication 138, ICRP decided to set up a dedicated task group on tolerability and reasonableness. And this is a topic which have been discussed with many organizations, and clearly in the perspective of how to make a decision at the different level, and including how far to go and what is the good level of protection. Having said that, you may have in mind the model of tolerability of risk, which had been introduced in publication 60 in 1990 by ICRP, relying on some work which have been developed, notably in the UK, to discuss what is acceptable, what is tolerable, and what is unacceptable. Nowadays, we move to a simplified model on one side, as you can see on the left part of the slide, where you just distinguish between what is tolerable and what is not tolerable. And then you have to define some radiological criterion in terms of level of individual exposure, which fit for this tolerability of risk. Then a key point is that nowadays we need to cope with different type of exposure situation. And then the radiological criterion is not necessarily an individual dose limit, but rather some value, some benchmark value, which allow to discuss what is tolerable, what is not tolerable. Having said that, the objective is not beyond this radiological criteria to go as low as possible, but really to introduce the optimization process. And the optimization process you see on the right part of the slide is a combination of different elements. We try to encapsulate these elements with relationship, resources, and rational. I will not develop too much. I have no time to go in detail, but the objective is not only driven by individual dose level. It's really something which need to rely on a process and to find what is the reasonable level, how to achieve a reasonable level as low as reasonably achievable. We try to define, to make a short definition of what could be reasonableness in terms of, in the revised framework for tolerability and of risk and reasonableness. We mentioned the reference to good judgment, fairness, practicability, moderateness, and appropriateness. So you see, the objective is not, again, to say to be as low as possible, but really to have something which refer to different aspects, and notably to be appropriate and to be moderate according to the situation. With regard to that, optimization has really to be considered as a deliberative process. This is not only based on calculation, it's based on different discussions, the dialogue, and we need to evaluate the different components and to find what we can call a reasonable compromise with all informed stakeholders. And then, for this perspective, we need to embark economic, societal, environmental, and ethical consideration. It's interesting to remind also the publication in this perspective, publication 101, the part B of this publication, published in 2006, which focus on broadening the process of optimization. And then you see already in this publication, we had a list of societal consideration and value, like equity, ability to control, sustainability, intergenerational consideration, individual and social benefit, the level of information and knowledge, and also a key element, which is social trust. All these processes need to rely on trust and confidence among the different stakeholders. And then on the right part, you have the 3R approach with rational relationship, rational and resources, and you have the reference to this paper if you want to go further for the list of different factors to be considered. Having said that, where we are now, so this is still rather conceptual elements that we discuss in the task group, and we try nowadays to go more into practical implementation to discuss what does it mean. But the general consideration means that the emphasis need to be put on the level of protection. We are looking for a good level of protection. We are not looking for the lowest level of exposure, but really to achieve a good level of protection. And then we need to have, for this good level of protection, we need, of course, to have due consideration to the level of risk associated with ionizing radiation under specific circumstances. That means everything is not the same depending on the situation. We need to consider the specific situation. But we don't need we don't need to take only into account the level of risk. We also need to include consideration like well-being, sustainable development, and all hazard approach. So having said that, this is interesting, but for sure, the key point is to discuss what does it mean into practice. Again, this is important to consider the process. What we mean is to achieve a reasonable level of exposure. And so this is really something which needs to be a deliberative process to embark the different stakeholders. We also pointed out the fact that there is a need to articulate between the principle of justification and optimization, and notably this is true in the case of medical exposure, but it could be true also on different type of exposure situation. We need to consider the prevailing circumstances. Depending on the specific situation, we will reach a different compromise, we will reach a different level of, we will reach different type of protection, and the good level of protection need to cope with a specific situation. We need to ensure the respect of ethical value, and then this is something I will come back on my last slide on this topic, and of course, to rely on the stakeholder involvement. And just to finish my presentation, I just would like to highlight some challenges at very low doses. The first element with at very low dose exposure, we need to cope with uncertainty on radiation-induced risk. This is the first point. There is no magic number where we can say that below this level we have no risk. And then for the uncertainty on radiation-induced risk at low level, we need to have value judgment. For the value judgment could be at the individual level or collective level, and that this value judgment will depend on a specific exposure situation. This refers to the level of protection, the question of well-being, and refer to the question of confidence. The other point is that there is no universal value for defining the trivial risk or negligible risk. In fact, the question of negligible risk or trivial risk, cannot be defined by ICRP. We cannot say that a level of risk is negligible in itself. It will depend on the specific situation, and then this is a matter for the regulator to define for specific aspect of the regulation, for specific type of exposure, to define what could be the level of risk below which the regulator doesn't care. But this is not the definition by itself from ICRP. And then the last point is that we need to rely on prudence and optimization. Clearly, the question of ethical value need to be highlighted at this level. We need to adopt LNT model, and this is some element on which ICRP largely discuss, and then to set up stakeholder participation. To adopt the LNT model doesn't mean that we need to reduce exposure as low as possible. We need to have stakeholder participation and dialogue to identify what is a good level of protection, proportionate to the issue at stake, and adopting holistic approach, and of course, relying on joint evaluation and ethical value. And then for this purpose, the task group is currently checking what does it mean for different specific situations to move from conceptual approach to more practical issue. And I hope that we will be able to discuss this element with the different people involved in radiation protection from different domains. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Thierry. On the same topic, we will have Roger Coates, who will provide the industry perspective on how to make better decisions at low dose. Roger has over 40 years experience as a senior health and safety professional in the UK nuclear industry. He was RPWG president from 2016 to 2020, and he is currently act as a consultant to World Nuclear Association. So welcome, Roger. The floor is yours.
Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. I'd like to thank ICRP and WNA for letting me have this opportunity to discuss how to take better decisions at very low dose exposures. And what do I mean by a very low dose? Essentially, it's a dose that is in the noise of the variation of natural background radiation, and as such makes no significant difference to anyone's total radiation exposure. And that means it's a dose in the tens of microsieverts, or possibly that little bit higher. And I would like to emphasise that on this particular topic, it's not just an issue for the ICRP and the system of protection. It's something for all of us if we're going to get it right. And that means authorities, regulators, and all of us in the wider profession. Because one concern I have is that we're becoming fixated on ever lower doses and forever chasing microsieverts. And another thing is, to what extent has perceived public concern been driving low-dose decision-making? But if you analyse it and think about it, does driving to low doses really ease public concern? Or does it actually make the public think, if it needs to be that low, this man-made radiation must be really dangerous compared to natural radiation? And hence, forever driving to low doses actually feeds radiation phobia. So we should beware reacting to perceived public concern by imposing very low dose decisions. And also in this, what's perhaps driving this trend, I think LNT is not helpful in this context because it feeds a perception of no safe level of radiation. And when we're discussing the risks of very low doses, we should focus more on what we really know about the risk. That if there is a risk, it's comparable with risks widely accepted in society, and it's bounded by an upper level. And we don't want to get fixated on LNT. And I think it's helpful to consider and compare two different exposure situations. And if we compare exposure, UK exposure in Cornwall, which is a high natural background area, and compare that on one hand with doses in the clearance system, then there are some interesting comparisons that come out of that. As far as Cornwall is concerned, the doses there, it's the UK average dose plus about 6 millisieverts a year. And a few years ago, I had a little bit of a dilemma because my granddaughter was considering going to a university in Cornwall. And of course, like everybody else, she had no idea of radiation, and all the people who visit Cornwall, which is a great holiday area, have no awareness or concern about the radiation dose that they're going to get. So my dilemma 3 years ago was, should I say anything to my granddaughter? After quite a bit of reflection, I decided that there were other more important issues in making her decision. And even though I did discuss it with her after she'd made her decision, I came to the view that it wasn't something that I should raise to complicate her decision-making process. Having said that, it did make me reflect on this system of protection that we have, and I'll certainly come back to this issue in my conclusions. So that's an issue of natural background radiation. If we compare and contrast that to this issue of the clearance processes, removing material from the system or from regulatory control. And I think clearance is becoming well recognised as one of the imbalances in our system. It's nominally based on a criterion of 10 microsieverts a year, but actually in practice, because of conservatism, it's much more restrictive than that. Doses down to fractions of a microsievert, at great cost to society, hundreds of millions of pounds on the UK decommissioning bill because of this. And if we compare and contrast these two exposure situations, we have clearance whereby doses to a few individuals are controlled such that nobody can get about a microsievert a year or so. And if we compare that with exposure from a holiday or a university course in Cornwall, where many people unknowingly receive a good fraction of a millisievert or even a few millisieverts a year, it's a situation which I believe is very difficult to explain, rationalise and understand, and certainly to members of the public. And I think one of the basic issue is, how do we allow some relatively larger exposures and compare that with the way the system forces down some exposures to very, very low levels, where the exposure actually makes no significant difference to the total exposure of any individual. And I would argue that because of that, we're contributing to poor utilisation of societal resources, and we risk bringing our profession into disrepute. And it's at variance with the common sense way we all live in a radiation environment. So what is there in the current system of protection to try and help these decisions at very low doses? Well, there's not a lot, but quite hidden away in ICRP publication 104, there is a terrific sentiment a paragraph that says, based on the general principles of good governance, governments have obligations to pursue optimal use of societal resources and not allow such resources to be squandered on unproductive legislation and fruitless regulatory control. Absolutely superb sentiment, but where's the practical follow-up? This is just completely buried somewhere in some deep text in an ICRP publication. And this now brings me on to my conclusions. And the first two are aimed at ICRP. And the first conclusion is ICRP should consider how best to resolve this imbalance that we've seen in the comparison with Cornwall and clearance. And if we think about it, my granddaughter Anna and her 3,000 fellow students on the Cornwall campus can happily and unknowingly, in accordance with the current system of protection ground rules, they can happily and unknowingly receive 3 millisieverts a year because it's natural radiation, whereas a dozen or so key workers in the recycling clearance industry are constrained to around 1 microsievert a year because it's man-made radiation. And here's me thinking that a dose is a dose, no matter what its origin. And in our profession, I think we're all duly proud that our system of protection is based on the sound science and good ethics, but we don't seem to care that it totally cuts across and ignores what most of us will consider to be common sense. And the other recommendation for ICRP is that somewhere in the system there should be a very visible top-tier statement supporting wider proportionality in the regulation of very low-dose activities and drawing attention to the need to avoid multiple conservatisms in assessment regimes. And the statement in ICRP 104 would be a good start, but don't bury it deep in some text and hide it. Make it top tier and totally visible. My second set of conclusions are aimed at authorities and regulators who should consider the disproportionate regulatory burden and potential misuse of public resources before they choose to impose microsievert level exposure restrictions on any regulated activities. The other text there under the asterisk accept that, yes, there could be additional stakeholder considerations arising from direct stakeholder engagement between the owner-operator of the exposure situation and those it impacted. But authorities should not impose very low doses and leading to a potential misuse of public resources. And in the same sort of context, the relevant authorities should review the clearance regime with a view to reducing the disproportionate regulatory burden while supporting the UN's development goals of sustainability and circular economy and recycling. My final point is one for all of us in our profession to reflect upon, and we should make better use of natural background exposure and its variability in any public discussion on radiation risk. And this gives a more realistic context to the level of risk at these very low exposures. Nothing to do with trying to justify the exposures, but just to give a realistic context of the types of dose involved. And at the same time, in my view, we should be very cautious of using the LNT concept to discuss or define risk at these very low exposure levels. So that's it. Thanks to all of you who are listening to this, and thanks for this opportunity to explore this with you.
So moving to the third topic today, on the views of the upcoming changes in the dose and dose rate effectiveness factor at low dose. I would like to invite Dominique Laurier to provide an overview of the work of the ICRP Task Group 91. Dominique is the Deputy Director of Health and at the Institute of Radiological Protection and Nuclear Safety in France. He is currently the chair of the ICRP Committee 1 on the effects of the radiation. So I would like to invite you, Dominique, to provide your presentation. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction, Sameh. And first of all, I would like to thank the organizers to invite me to give this talk. Can you see my slides? The first one, is it okay?
Yes.
Okay. So very briefly, I'm going to come back to one topic which is under discussion in Committee 1, so the committee, the ICRP Committee on Health Effects. The current situation, which is the dose and dose rate effectiveness factor. So the current situation, at the time being, the detriment, the risk of cancer associated to radiation exposure is based mostly on risk models from the A-bomb survivors. And a parameter, the dose and dose rate effectiveness factors of 2, is applied. So instead of using directly the risk models from the A-bomb survivors, these risk models, the value estimated are divided by a factor of 2 to take into account a reduction of risk at low doses and low dose rates. This parameter has been implemented in the calculation of the detriment in the ICRP system in publication 60. So it's there since the 90s, and it has not been re-evaluated since then. So we have one task group, TG91, which is dealing specifically with this topic to provide update on the low dose and low dose rate effectiveness factor. Their duty is to review the current knowledge, scientific knowledge, on the effects of low doses and of low dose rate at the molecular, cellular, animal, and human levels, and to provide potential for the 2 components of the dose and dose rate effectiveness factor. The first one is the low dose effectiveness. Is the strength of the association between radiation and cancer risk lower at low doses than at high doses? And the second component, which is low dose rate effectiveness, is the risk of cancer associated to radiation exposure lower when the dose is protected over time or received as an acute exposure? And to do that, so the group considered the definition of low doses, which is the one defined by Untitled, which is written here. So this is the composition of the membership of the task group. The task group is shared by Werner Rühm, who has been presenting a few minutes before, including 10 different members with complementary competencies in biology and epidemiology mostly. The work that has been done by this task group is written here. So they reviewed the historical development of the dose and dose rate effectiveness factor, and they reviewed the available data on cellular, animal experiments, epidemiological studies. From this review of the literature, they published 15 articles that have been published, and the list is available on the ICRP website. And they developed a draft report, which is almost finalized. The draft report is in pre-consultation phase with different stakeholders that are in close relationship with ICRP, including WNA. So thank you for your comments. And we hope that the public consultation will be open at the beginning of 2025 with a publication of the report, which is expected end of 25 or beginning of 26. So very rapidly, what are the main points of conclusion of this task group? This is the main points as they are presented in the pre-consultation draft report, so it still may change. But the first point is that the report evaluated the current scientific evidence on both components, so the LDEF, low dose effectiveness factor, and the dose rate effectiveness factor. The aim of the report is not to provide a new value for dose and dose rate effectiveness factor, but just to provide what is the current state of scientific knowledge. The first point on in vitro results, mutation, cell transformation, cytogenetic, the numeral values for both DREF and LRF are below 4. From animal experiments, so in vivo experiments, the values, the range of value is mostly between 1 and 2, with a large variation depending on the tumor type. From epidemiology, meta-analysis of the dose rate, so looking at studies providing results from population that have been exposed protractively over time. The range is between 1 and 3. And the analysis of curvature, so from the A-bomb survivors data, comparing the result of the slope of the dose-risk relationship in the low dose range compared to the high dose range. So for the LDEF, the value is approximately between 1 and 2 for all solid cancers together. So the conclusion, the overall conclusion of the report is that for both low dose effectiveness factor and dose rate effectiveness factors, values much larger than 3 or less than 1 are unlikely. The range appears largely consistent with the various sources of data, which are listed above this line, and it's clearly narrower than earlier ranges that have been estimated. In the 90s, the range was more between 1 and 20. Today, we have a range, let's say, between 1 and 3. So there are still residual uncertainties, but we have much more information today than we had 30 years ago. So this is the conclusion for task group 91. No 2 slides to conclude, but to say that, of course, the final aim for committee 1 is to update the calculation of the detriment for cancers. So TG91 is almost finished and providing a very good overview of what is known for dose and dose rate effectiveness factor. But the final aim is to consider the results of all the different task groups that are ongoing in C1 and to integrate all these different results in an updated assessment scheme for radiation-related risk in the low dose and low dose range. So the results of TG91 provide an update of dose rate effectiveness factor and low dose effectiveness factors. It contributes to the decision about the choice of the shape of the dose-risk relationship that will be used for the calculation of detriment in the low dose range. But as has been said by other speakers, by Thierry especially just before, other hypotheses in the low dose range, other factors have to be taken into account. The existence or not of a threshold, the linear no threshold hypothesis, the variations of risk with sex, age, different regions in the world, differences between cancer sites, and outside of the shade of the dose relationship, the question about the severity of cancers, about the potential impact of non-cancer diseases, hereditary effects, and also long-term non-cancer effects. And finally, the aim is to improve the interpretation of risk at low doses, to clarify the calculation of the detriment, and to improve risk communication about low dose risks. So this last slide is clearly to open the discussion beyond the dose and dose rate effectiveness factors. And with this, I would like to thank you for your attention. Same, I give you back the floor.
Thank you very much, Dominique. On the same topic, we will have Masanori Kitahara, who will provide the industry perspective on the views of the upcoming changes in the dose and dose rate effectiveness factor at low dose. Masanori Kitahara is the manager of the Radiological Management Group at Kansai Electric Power Company in Japan. He is currently the chair of the Radiation Protection Working Group of the Federation of the Electric Power Companies of Japan. Masanori, floor is yours.
Thank you, Same.
Great.
Hello everyone. I am Masanori Kitahara from Kansai Electric Power. I am pleased and grateful to have the opportunity to present in front of you all at this webinar. I would like to talk to you about the impact of the change to the dose and dose effectiveness factor on radiation protection at nuclear power plant in Japan. We believe that discussions of dose and dose effectiveness factor should proceed with careful consideration of the situation. For example, in Japan, many workers are employed at multiple nuclear power plants. Even if radiation exposure is controlled at a certain level at one power plant, working at multiple power plants throughout the year can increase annual radiation exposure. The legal dose limited in Japan is 100 millisievert over 5 years. Therefore, many companies control their exposure at an average of 20 millisievert per year. This table shows the distribution of radiation dose for workers at different work sites in Japan in fiscal year 2010 before Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant accident. The horizontal axis shows the number of sites the workers work across, and vertical axis shows the radiation dose they received per year, showing the distribution of the number of workers. As you can see from the table, many workers are employed at the multiple sites. I would like to pay attention to the red part. There were 2,548 workers who were exposed to more than 10 millisievert per year. This is equivalent to approximately 3.2% of the total. When the ICRP published its recommendation, it is reflected in the regulation of each country. If those limits were to be halved, some number of the workers might not be able to work, and they might feel anxious. If the dose and dose rate effectiveness factor change from 2 to 1, it is expected that Japanese laws will be stricter, reducing the recommended annual exposure from 20 millisievert to 10 millisievert. In this case, some number of workers would be difficult to work, which might have impact on the industry. We would like to resist the change in dose and dose rate effectiveness factor due to insufficient scientific evidence. We would like the ICRP to feel connected to the impact of the recommendation. This is all for my presentation. Thank you for listening. Thank you, Sami.
Thank you so much, Masanori, for providing the industry perspective on this topic. And I think we can review this topic again during the panel discussions and the questions and answer. Moving to the fourth topic today on the individual sensitivity and the nuclear industry, I would like to invite Simon Bouffler to provide the ICRP perspective on this topic. And Simon Bouffler is the Deputy Director of Radiation Protection Sciences at the UK Health Security Agency and the Vice Chair of the ICRP Commission. He has over 30 years of experience in radiation protection and has interest in the mechanism underlying radiogenic diseases. Simon, floor is yours.
Thank you, Sami, and thank you very much for the invitation to talk briefly today for this webinar. So as said, I am going to be talking about individual sensitivity and in particular ICRP activities which sort of relate to nuclear industry considerations. Yeah, okay, thank you. And if you can move on to the next slide, perhaps, Charlotte. So, I mean, you will all know this. The current system of protection is set up with the following sort of top-line ambitions, really, to avoid tissue injuries, otherwise known as deterministic effects, and to minimise the risk of stochastic effects to the extent reasonably achievable. And then we're talking about cancers and hereditary effects there. And that's achieved through justification, optimisation, and dose limitation. But those limits are derived from a notional average person that doesn't actually exist, the average in terms of age and sex, for example. If you move on one, it brings in a little animation. So clearly it's a population-based system rather than an individual-based system. If you can move to the next slide, Charlotte, please. We know that there's several different categories of person or groups, population groups needing protection. There's the public first and foremost, the widest group of people you can imagine, covering all ages from the very youngest to the very oldest in society, some with underlying health conditions as well. Secondly, in the occupational sector, you're dealing with a somewhat more restricted population with a more limited age range, so probably from the age of 18 through to probably 65 or thereabouts. And actually predominantly male, at least historically predominantly male, at least. Third sector, a third category really is the medical area, which is, different. We've looked at from the public, which is the full range, more limited in occupational, but very limited in the medical sector, where there's an individual relationship between a patient, one patient, and their medical consultants and practitioners and so forth. So the way the system works is in the public, occupational and medical sectors is different in terms of the relationship between the exposure and an individual or an exposure and a whole population, depending on which one you're looking at. And if you could move to the next slide, please, Charlotte. Just a note, ICRP, as Werner noted right at the top of the webinar here, has got 2 active task groups in this general area of individualization, both of which I've got the privilege of chairing. Task Group 111 concerns factors governing the individual response of humans to ionizing radiation. Task Group 128 is about individualization and stratification in radiological protection and the implications it might have in different areas of application. So if you move on one more, Charlotte, that brings in a bit more text. Task Group 111 is the more mature task group. It's been running for around 5 years now. And it's very much scientific review across all health outcomes, cancers and non-cancer outcomes, to ask the question, what is the evidence that there's variation in response between individuals? So it's really addressing the can radiological protection be individualized or stratified? So is there the evidence upon which to base any more individualized system? If you move on one more, Charlotte brings a little bit more text about Task Group 128, which started only just about a year ago, which really addresses the questions, more practical questions about where might there be opportunities to adopt an individualized or stratified approach. So really putting that into sort of, more common language, if you like, it addresses the question, should radiological protection be individualized and stratified? So it's very much a divided activity, and that's reflected in the membership. a sort of deep level of scientific expertise in Task Group 111, and a much wider pool of expertise in Task Group 128. And that's also reflected by the sponsoring committees within the ICRP, and the Task Group 111 is sponsored by committees 1 and 3, whereas Task Group 128 is sponsored by all 4 committees, in fact, because it shows the wide interest of the topic in the system of protection. So moving on, one more, please, Charlotte. Yeah, so I'm sharing here, and I do want to emphasize these are personal views. They're not views emerging from either of the task groups. Task Group 128 in particular is perhaps of more interest, is not mature enough yet to have been drawing conclusions. But to my personal thoughts on musings in the area of occupational exposures. So the International Labour Organization are clearly against the use of genetic testing in the workplace. So that's one fundamental thing that has to be borne in mind, that contextualizes everything. And if you move on to the next bullet point, Charlotte, please. We know, and it has been emphasized within the report that will emerge from Task Group 111, that there is age and sex dependence of cancer risk, and that in principle could be used to assign lower risk groups to higher risk tasks, largely allocating high risk tasks to older males, basically. If you move to the next point, Charlotte, thanks. So, but how would that sort of age and sex point fit with legislation and TU views? And the next one, please, Charlotte. There is a special case to note in there has been historically different limits for astronauts, which is a very particular population, very limited population at the moment. Next point, please, Charlotte. So a case could be made for stratification in the workplace, but I think it's a very sensitive issue and very unlikely to be adopted. So if you move to the final point, I think, Charlotte, here. So should we individualize? Well, perhaps a case can be made in the case of high-risk work in emergency recovery. There's different limits in emergencies that apply anyway, but in a more general sense, I would say no. And so that's my own personal thoughts on the topic, and I'll be very interested to hear from WNA colleague on it as well. So thank you very much for your attention, and Sami, back to you.
Thank you very much, Simon. I will move now to John Takala from Cameco to provide the industry views on the individual sensitivity of radiation exposure. John is the Director of Safety, Health, Environment and Quality System at Cameco Corporation. He has over 3 decades experience in radiation protection in uranium industry. He has been a member of the World Nuclear Association Radiation Protection Working Group for about 20 years. John also has been a member of the ICRP Committee 4 since 2013. John, the floor is yours, and over to you.
Thank you. Can you hear me and see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. So it's my outline of my talk. In interest of time, I'll just leap right into it. So this graph from ICRP publication 147 shows how lifetime risks vary with age, sex, and population groups. And we certainly recognize the current and ongoing scientific studies of individual sensitivity to radiation, and that's an important part of the field of radiation protection. And in particular, we note that the outcomes of these studies are likely to be quite relevant and important in the medical sector, where individual doses from some medical treatments and pathways can reach many tens of millisieverts and higher. And whilst there may be a very small number of occupational exposure situations where such considerations involving particularly high individual exposures, such as space travel, may be relevant, we believe the situation in the nuclear industry and most other occupational situations is completely different. The international nuclear industry has for many years had an impressive record of controlling occupational exposures. The top figure shows the average annual effective dose for workers at nuclear power plants around the world over the last several decades, and the bottom table shows the doses for the entire nuclear fuel cycle. And whilst there are variations across individual sectors within the fuel cycle, the industry has been able to demonstrate the central importance of exposure optimization, with the current average worker doses being around millisievert per year for the whole nuclear fuel cycle.
Almost a third of the way through it, and it just...
This is within the variation of natural background radiation or close to it. And this excellent performance of the nuclear industry in the application of optimization shows the current system is useful, efficient, very practical at controlling doses and protecting workers and members of the public. Now, if we look radiation exposures in the medical field, it's quite different than occupational exposure situations. The medical treatment is personalized and involves the identification of subgroups and stratification of patient populations to improve treatment and reduce risks of side effects. There are no dose limits, and dose constraints are applied for patients. And justification of a radiological practice in the nuclear industry is general. It's generic to the particular sector, while in medicine is much more specific, down to the specific medical procedures and the individual involved. And the benefits to patients can be very high from these medical procedures involving radiation exposures, but the associated doses can also be much higher compared to occupational exposures. So broad adoption of individualization for most planned exposure situations, and certainly for the nuclear fuel cycle, does not seem to be justified at the current time. Given the low level of exposures associated with the nuclear industry, whether to workers or the public, there is no compelling justification for applying a complex, formal, individual dose limitation system as part of the control system for occupational and public exposures. We feel this would be totally disproportionate use of resources. That said, there is a limited role currently for individualization in the nuclear industry. In particular, I'm thinking of in environmental assessments when we're addressing risk to children and infants from discharges, and in addition with pregnant women and breastfeeding mothers. However, these are exceptions to the norm and are largely currently in place. The ICRP system has a number of strengths, including, it's got a solid scientific basis, it's protective in most situations, and for the most part, practical to implement. However, the system is quite complex, and this is, in part, just to be scientifically sound and rigorous, there's going to be complexity. However, I draw the distinction between the behind-the-scenes scientific complexity and the calculations of how we get to things with the more outward-facing management system parts of the system that most people interact with. Just like my little visual here of the guts of a cell phone, which we all carry, and we have no idea how any of that stuff works, but we're all quite happy to use the simple apps. We don't want to introduce more complexity in the system and create potential confusion with the general public and RP practitioners unless there's a compelling need to. As experts in the system, to varying degrees, we see this complexity, but most people want to use the simple apps, not this complexity. And then a final point there is individualization raises broader social and equity issues. It's not just science, it's quite complex. And I think of Canada a number of years ago debated the proposed at the time 1 millisievert limit for pregnant workers, and significant concerns were raised at the time about this being a barrier to employment for women. And the limit was in the end lowered from 10 millisieverts to 4 millisieverts, not 1 millisievert as proposed by ICRP in 1990. So trying to wrap up here, the application of individualized approach could be appropriate in some situations where there are high doses, space travel, medical sector. However, in the nuclear industry, for many years, we've controlled and reduced our occupational and public exposures from ionizing radiation. And the overwhelming majority of occupational exposures in the fuel cycle are at most a few millisieverts per year. There is a tail that goes a bit higher, but for most people, it's comparable to natural background levels. Public exposures from the nuclear industry are a small fraction of this, small fraction of a millisievert per year. And we don't see a justification for applying a complex formal individual dose limitation system as part of the control system. This would be a disproportionate use of resources, and just there isn't a compelling case for it. And we continue to support the science behind it, and in particular applications, and in our case, for pregnant women, breastfeeding mothers, and considering different age groups in the environmental impact assessments from discharges. However, the adoption of a more individualized approach for the nuclear industry is not, we don't believe, is consistent with the graded approach considering the LNT model, as this would introduce more complexity, create more confusion with very limited benefits. And with that, I will stop. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sean. Now, last but not least, we will have two presentations on the role of the ICRP on the system of radiological protection in the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Back to you, Werner, to provide the ICRP perspective on this topic.
I think it should work now, right?
Looks good.
Yes.
Okay, so let's come back. Me again, sorry for that. Now we come to the Sustainable Development Goals and RP. First of all, let me just introduce the Sustainable Development Goals. They were established by the United Nations in 2015, and they are part of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development of the Planet. Each of those goals, 17 altogether, have specific targets and indicators to measure progress. And it's important to understand that some of those goals are often interrelated, and actions taken to achieve one goal may have positive or negative impacts on another goal. You see the 17 goals here. I think, Pete, now in your next presentation, no need to introduce them anymore, so this may save some time for you. Now, we have thought in the main commission of ICRP that we should think about how we can contribute, we in radiological protection, how we contribute to those sustainable development goals. And this is the paper summarizing our views on that. This came out just a couple of days ago, 2 weeks ago. It's an open access paper, and it caused quite some attraction already, so more than 5,000 downloads during the first 2 weeks. Now, the major messages in the paper are that the current system of radiological protection is implicitly already linked to sustainable development, implicitly, but except for very rare cases, we do not say that explicitly. The second major message is that the main commission proposes that sustainability should be considered more explicitly addressed in the next general recommendations, as we are now in the process to review and revise the system. It's a good opportunity to think of whether we could include the idea of sustainable development into the system. And finally, the main commission again considers that this could be a task which could be done jointly together with all those who are interested in this issue. And that's why we are very happy that during this webinar, we can also discuss this topic, sustainable development. Now, I will give you a few examples where how we tried in the paper to demonstrate that we implicitly really contribute to many of those goals. One is, for example, SDG 1 and poverty in all its forms everywhere. And there is a sub-goal which says build the resilience of the poor and those in vulnerable situations and reduce their exposure to climate-related extreme events and other economic and so on disasters. And then, of course, immediately it came to our mind that in publication 109, for example, we provide guidance for optimal protection of people living in long-term contaminated areas, resulting from either nuclear accident or a radiation emergency. And there is another example, more recent example, publication 146, which recommends optimal protection of people and the environment in a large nuclear accident. For example, drawing on experience, of course, of the Chernobyl and Fukushima accidents. So clearly, this is an example where we do contribute to a sustainable development goal of the United Nations, but we do not say it explicitly. Another example, which is quite obvious, I think, SDG 3, ensure healthy lives and promote well-being for all at all ages. And if you read the sub-goals, there is one to reduce by 1/3 premature mortality from non-communicable diseases through prevention and treatment. And another sub-goal to reduce the number of deaths and illness from hazardous chemicals and air, water, and soil pollution and contamination. And again, if you look, for example, at publication 135, and those are just examples, there are many more. Publication 135, where we recommend quantities for use as diagnostic reference levels for various imaging modalities. And publication 140, which provides an overview of therapeutic procedures and a framework for calculating radiation doses for various treatment approaches. And it's clear that it's very obvious that we in radiation protection, we can contribute to this SDG 3. And there are many other examples, and maybe it's not necessary given the time to look at all of them. Maybe this one again, SDG 8, to promote sustained, inclusive, and sustainable economic growth, full and productive employment and decent work for all. And sub-goal 8.2 says to achieve higher levels of economic productivity through diversification, technological upgrading, and innovation. And one example is publication 123, which describes the terms and methods used to assess the radiation exposure of astronauts in space. Or in a similar way, ICRP publication 132, which describes the basic radiological protection principles that apply to passengers and aircraft crew. So again, we really can contribute in this context. This is another example, SDG 15, on the protection of terrestrial ecosystems, and sub-goal 15.1 to ensure the conservation, restoration, and sustainable use of terrestrial ecosystems. And you may remember that in publication 91, already in 2003, ICRP provided guidelines for measuring the impact of radiation on the environment to optimize protection, or more recently, publication 108, which provides a methodological framework for terrestrial reference plans. And finally, last example of many others which are given in the paper, SDG 17, with the sub-goal 17.6 to enhance international cooperation on and access to science, technology and innovation, and enhance knowledge sharing on mutually agreed terms, and so on. And I gave you already an example in my previous presentation. We try to establish and use our international relations to discuss with the whole community how to develop radiological protection, the system of radiological protection further. And this was one of those examples where we collected feedback and published feedback from the international community. Or another example shown here, we organize meetings with organizations in formal relationships with ICRP. And just let me mention last year, because last year we had our meeting in Bristol, UK, and with the help of WNA, where we had a lot of discussions on various topics. So it's quite easy to see that implicitly we really contribute already to the Sustainable Development Goals, but we never framed it like that, we in ICRP. And my personal hope is at least that if we do so and explain that, we may get more attraction from young people who are concerned about the future of our planet to join radiation protection if they understand that they could, in joining radiation protection, contribute to a sustainable development of our planet. And with this, a very short epilogue. The idea behind is not new, really. And I was really stunned when I read the Lauriston Taylor lecture of Merrill Eisenbart in 1983, where he talked about the human environment, past, present, future. Maybe some of you know Merrill Eisenbart. He was a very famous radiation scientist, let's say 50 years ago. And in his lecture, he actually talked about climate change, global warming, international relationships. And then he says, those of us who are trained to think about the environment in professional terms, and this is us actually, we in radiation protection, must begin to contemplate aspects that are more fundamental than control over pollution. So we have to think beyond just dosimetry. That's my translation. And what he says further is that it's our responsibility to future generations to achieve a world in which people live in peace and in which our numbers subsist in a comfortable equilibrium in energy and other resources available to us. And this is already the idea of sustainability in this presentation, 40 or more years ago. And this leads to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. This is our language today, the modern language, if you like. And this led to our paper. And here again are the three major messages of the paper. And with this, I would like to finish and thank you again for raising the issue of sustainable development here.
Thank you very much, Werner. Before moving to Pete to provide the industry views on the same topic, it seems that we have received many questions from the audience, and most of them, as I can see, answered by our panelists by typing the answers in the Q&A box. I would like again to encourage you to post your questions in the Q&A box to discuss them later during the panel discussion. Now, I would like to introduce Peter Bryant, who is an experienced radiation protection and environmental professional with over 17 years experience working across the nuclear fuel cycle. He is currently the director of ESG and radiation strategy for Sizewell C, a new build in the UK, where he leads on the sustainability, radiation protection, decommissioning, and policy engagement. Pete also is the chair of the World Nuclear Association Radiation Protection Working Group. So Pete, hand over to you.
Thanks, Same, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone on the call. I'm not going to labour on too many of the points that already Werner's done a great job at presenting, so I'm just going to dive straight in. So as Werner already mentioned, UN Sustainable Development Goals, I suspect a lot of us are quite familiar with them, and they all got announced roughly in 2015. Now, since the introduction of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, various sectors and industries across the world have started considering, what does this mean in practice? What does this mean to us? So if we look at the nuclear industry, for example, last year, the IAEA held its first conference, which was really focusing on sustainability. And then from that, this year in August, they held a technical meeting on nuclear site repurposing and stakeholder engagement in the context of circular economy and sustainability. So the IAEA started to think, what does this mean in practice? What do we need to do to develop this further? And in parallel, as you just heard from Werner as well, you've got things like the paper that the ICRP have produced, and more recently another paper that's came out literally a week or two later, which is looking at some of the practitioners' views on what the system of protection might mean in meeting the UN Sustainable Development Goals. But what's really important to note here is, whereas the nuclear industry and the radiation protection sectors have started to consider what this means, other sectors, again as highlighted by Werner, have been considering this for a really long time. So if you look at how far the construction sector has gone, this has been much more well developed. And probably most importantly, the financial sector has really started laying down the foundations of what sustainable development and the UN SDGs mean in practice. So what you might have seen in various areas is this thing called ESG being referred to. Now, ESG is basically another phrase for sustainability, but it's very much more measurable. It's short for environmental, social, and governance, and it's a set of standards for measuring a business's impact on society, the environment, but importantly also how transparent and accountable it is. So it relies on businesses being very open and transparent about what they're doing well in, but also what they're not doing well in. And what I would also emphasize here is it's beyond legal compliance. Demonstrating you're really good at ESG doesn't mean you're just saying you're complying with the law. It's about doing good, doing beyond that legal compliance. And why that's really important is because 2/3 of investors now take ESG factors into account when investing in a company. So this means ESG has the potential to grow businesses whilst also benefiting and doing good for the environment, but also delivering social value to communities. And you'll see ESG referred to more and more in the future across every sector. It's not just for nuclear industry, but it will play a really, really important role. So why is this so important now to developing the ICRP system and how things move going forward? Well, this comes back to something that Sama said at the very, very start of her call, which was the net zero nuclear industry pledge, which committed to a goal of at least tripling the nuclear capacity by 2050. Now, I can give you the numbers in terms of gigawatts, but what probably is more useful is to define it in terms of what does this mean roughly in terms of number of nuclear power stations. So what that means is replacing 450 reactors, at least, depending on the size of them, by 2050, because by 2050, a number of those power stations will be 60 to 80 years old, but it will also mean building another 1,000 additional reactors. Now, for those of you on the call that come from the nuclear sector, you'll see that and you'll recognize that's a really big challenge. But ESG and green financing is going to play a very, very important role in delivering these futures. So we must make sure that whatever we're doing from an ICRP perspective and wider radiation protection side aligns with the already well-established sustainability standards out there from the financial sector. So recognizing this challenge, back in 15th of May this year, the Society for Radiological Protection held at its annual conference a workshop, and that was done in partnership with the ICRP and the World Nuclear Association. And it was held both physically, as in face-to-face attendees, but also virtually, so we allowed virtual participation as well. Now, within this workshop, we tried to answer what seemed like two very simple questions in some ways, but are very, very difficult questions in reality. And we did this by having a number of panelists that spoke from both industry and ICRP. And then we had a big Q&A session with lots of interactivity and quite a lively session. Now, the two questions we tried to answer was, firstly, what's the role of ICRP in the system of protection in enabling the deployment of technologies that support the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So this comes back to the kind of things that Werner was speaking about. But then secondly, they're also trying to look at what's the role of ICRP and the system of protection in driving sustainable decision-making and sustainable outcomes from the application of a system of protection. And they're subtly different because the latter is really looking about sustainable outcomes from all of the decision-making you're doing within the process. So the findings of that workshop kind of can be summarized into a number of key points. Firstly, and I think we all recognize it, that the importance of sustainability is increasing at a global level. Secondly, there's a need for a coordinated and consistent approach to ensure that developments of standards and regulations, not only across nuclear and radiation protection, but that wider sustainability remits align. So what we do not need is a new publication saying what sustainability is. We do not need to design a new way of dealing with or implementing sustainability. Those standards exist. What we're really looking at is there a delta, is there a gap that we need to align and bridge the ICRP system of protection in to allow those sustainable outcomes to be reached. So some of the key focus areas identified worth looking at further details in the context of radiation protection were the need to move to sustainable decision-making. So this comes back to what Thierry was talking about earlier around optimization. So making sure we're not just focusing on dose and safety, but we are considering those wider sustainable sustainability factors. So social value, for instance, in terms of what this brings to the communities and to the wider nation or world. We need to look at addressing some specific challenges around circular economy. This came up time and time again, and that's also why it's been part of a focus for the IEA as well. And one of the main areas that was mentioned a number of times was the context of clearance and exemptions. So what we mean by this is don't throw away resources due to a very low level of radiation contamination when they could be used. That is not a sustainable outcome. So we need to make sure we're maximizing the use and reuse of our existing resources. We need to address challenges in communications, collaborations, engagement, including tackling misinformation to enable sustainable outcomes in the context of radiation protection. There are a number of times where we won't be able to deliver something which is more environmentally sustainable because of social and societal concerns. And so we need to try and bring that into balance to reach that wider sustainable outcome. We need to consider resource availability in different countries when applying the system of protection. Now, this is something which is really, really key. When we start looking at other countries around the world, say some of the developing countries, they might have huge challenges in water supply. So when they're struggling to provide drinking waters for their countries, are they going to spend millions and millions and millions of pounds or dollars or whatever currency on minor improvements in radiation protection and safety? Is that sustainable? Is that the right outcome? So we really need to consider that flexibility when looking at the system of protection. And lastly, one of the key points that was stressed throughout is that any amendments need to consider usability and, importantly, unintended consequences. A lot of the times we hit challenges in sustainability or in the wider fields is because of those unintended consequences. We thought these things wouldn't occur, but they do occur. So one really good example given was in modern insulated houses. So such in the UK, there's been a massive push to increase insulation in houses and keep in heating. What does that do to radon levels? So in areas of the UK where radon levels are much higher, what does that mean? So that's an example of an unintended consequence. And lastly, we need to be really clear. So this includes how the ICRP system of protection is translated into domestic regulation and standards. Do we end up with the meaning being lost, and therefore that drives some unsustainable or unforeseen outcomes? I'll leave it there at that point. I just got a QR code on the screen there if anyone wants to access the open access paper, which summarizes the outputs of that workshop. I'll leave it on there for a few more seconds and I'll take it off the screen, but I'll hand back over to Same to take it from there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pete, and thanks to all presenters for their great contribution to the webinar. We are now coming to the last part of the webinar, the panel discussion. First, I would like to introduce another panelist who hasn't given a presentation, that is Anna Clark. Anna Clark is the head of Waste and Environmental Safety Section in the IAEA Departments of Nuclear Safety and Security. Prior to joining the IAEA, she held a role as the Chief Strategic and the Head of Decommissioning and Remediation for the UK Nuclear Decommissioning Authority. She was the architect of the IAEA recent international conference on ensuring safety and enabling sustainability in the context of radioactive waste management, decommissioning, and remediation. So we welcome Anna, and I will leave it to you now, Anna, to give your perspective on enabling sustainable development through the system of protection based on the outcomes of the IAEA International Conference, which was held last year in November. Hand over to you, Anna.
Thank you, Same, and thank you to WNA and ICRP for inviting me to provide IAEA's perspective on this topic, for the opportunity to share some key messages that were prompted by the recent conference. And I will start by saying that there's no doubt in my mind that the system of radiological protection contributes to sustainable development. There is already so much in the principles of justification, optimization, and limitation that points to consideration of sustainability. So instead of discussing the system itself, I'd just like to provide a few key messages regarding the implementation of the RP system, what I'll call radiation safety, as captured in the IAEA safety standards, and what it means to implement the system so that the use of ionizing radiation meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And I'd also like to reflect briefly not only on what the system of protection contributes to sustainability, but also how, if we do it right, sustainability and the Sustainable Development Goals can inform our approach to radiation safety. So my first key message is that safety is a minimum requirement for sustainability. For the use of ionizing radiation to be sustainable and to contribute to clean energy, food safety, health, and so on, it needs to be safe, safe for people and the environment. And in accordance with one of the fundamental safety principles, which emphasizes the need to protect present and future generations, the use of ionizing radiation needs to be safe throughout its lifetime. This means that at the point of justifying a facility or activity that gives rise to radiation risks, as well as considering safe operations, we also need to consider safe decommissioning of facilities and safe management of radioactive waste and discharges. Sadly, we are faced globally with legacies of activities where the full life cycle was not considered, legacies from which we could and should learn. And yet, despite these lessons and fundamental safety principles, the potential for creating further legacy sites and waste with no management route still feels very real. Another key message, while an activity is sustainable only if it is safe, the reverse is not true. An activity can be safe without being sustainable. An activity can be safe, but it can damage the environment, the society, and the economy, and be a burden to future generations. And this concept is captured well in the principle of optimization of protection, which, when translated into the IAEA safety standards, calls for consideration of these economic, social, and environmental factors, the three pillars of sustainability. So in practice, having set the starting point for optimization, your dose constraint or your reference level, optimization is a comparison of options for further reducing the level of dose or risk. So with examples dear to my heart, looking at options for the rate of discharge, the level of isolation for waste, the end state for cleanup and remediation. And optimization of protection requires that we consider the impact of those options on economy, society, and the environment. Simple? No, not quite the opposite. So ultimately, the implementation of the system relies on radiological criteria. For decision makers, it's comfortable if the criteria are predefined. And in this light, the principle of limitation of risk to individuals, is well used. Nice, clear numbers. But optimization is simply not like that. Optimization of protection requires a thorough assessment, and it requires a conversation. And the preferred option will be case specific. Indeed, it makes no sense for the radiation safety community to talk to itself about the impact of different options on society in any given situation. This community, including operators, regulators, policymakers, must engage with interested parties. And that's not just listening to views expressed about the impacts on sustainability, but taking account of these views in decision making. And I would say that at least with the Sustainable Development Goals, we have a tangible expression of sustainability, a common lens through which interested parties and decision makers can view the potential benefits and detriments of different options. But it remains a difficult exercise and a difficult conversation. And we all know examples of where optimization of protection has been misinterpreted as dose minimization at any cost. And this is much more comfortable place to be. Keep driving down that dose. But if it's done, we know that there is potential to do more harm than good. So to put the optimization principle into practice and genuinely consider sustainability, this is going to require more guidance, more tools, and importantly, we'll need a very informed safety community, a community that understands this is not safety versus sustainability. It's not that safety is being compromised. Safety is applied such that it produces the best outcomes for sustainable development. And webinars like this are a really important part of that journey. And therefore, I really thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna. And now we have a moderated discussions. We have received a number of questions through the Q&A function in Zoom. Maybe regarding the first topic of the future of radiation protection profession and tripling RP workforce capacity. There is a question to you, Chris. As you mentioned in your presentation that the position of the organization in formal relation with the ICRP SLOs supports the Vancouver call for actions to strengthen expertise in the radiation protection worldwide. Based on the outcomes of the last ICRP SLO meetings in Bristol and Munich, what do you think the urgent actions needed to address this challenge?
Thanks for the question, Same. So I'll just raise a couple of points that were raised, in fact, during meetings with the liaison organizations in the last couple of years. One is to raise awareness about the impact of or the consequences of reducing expertise in the field of radiological protection. I discussed this briefly during my presentation, and one key example, for instance, is an impact of a loss of RP expertise could be it's not possible to make progress in technologies that will be beneficial to the world that are related to radiation because there won't be the expertise there to support it. Another point is to develop strategic messages around the Vancouver call for action and reach out to beyond the RP community. I mean, we have to talk to people other than ourselves, otherwise what's the point? In particular, looking at the political level, high-level management, and UN and government groups about the issues raised in the Vancouver call. And of course, we have to do something, take actions, as Josip was talking about, to make the RP profession interesting, attractive, and just known by people who might be interested in joining the RP profession, so that we can actually increase capacity. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Chris. And on the same topic, there is a question to you, Joseph. It's good to see that both ICRP and World Nuclear Association are forward-looking, aiming to filling the gap, as you said, by making the radiation protection an attractive and more visible choice for practitioners and the scientists. Who should be leading this effort? And on the industry side, what specific action should be launched first to lay the groundwork for the success?
Thank you, Same. So as Chris mentioned during his presentation, I think it's important to note that no single organization can address the need for tripling the RP workforce capacity on their own. So no single organization can necessarily do this. We have initiatives, good initiatives like the Vancouver Call to Action. We have the IRPA 2024 pledge, but their implementation is going to require an investment now to ensure that we have the resources when they're needed in the future. And I think, the good examples of that is, ICRP and the Mentee position that they've made to attract, younger radiation protection professionals to take part in the important work that task groups are doing. So we need these kind of initiatives. And what we need to recognize is that there's a long timeline required to develop an RP professional, and especially an RP expert or radiation protection expert. And so we need all the nuclear related organizations to collectively attract, develop, and support these individuals now before they're actually needed, and so that way they're ready for that time. And although organizations would like to just hire these resources just when they're needed, I think we've collectively realized that if we take this approach, we will find that the resources and the expertise that we need will not be available to us, and we will not be able to meet the need for tripling the nuclear capacity. And so what we need is organizations willing to dedicate their staff to supporting radiation protection societies, for going out and doing outreach programs. We need this now, and we need organizations to allow people to take part in the World Nuclear Association and the work of the ICRP. And so this means that nuclear organizations, particularly the nuclear industry, needs to be willing to dedicate the time of the RP experts to take part in organizations like the ICRP, so we can support the revision of the general recommendations. And this is something that the WNA-ICRP working group will lead through its influence as an organization representing a large portion of the nuclear industry. And in the same way, we're asking for organizations like the ICRP with their call to action to ensure that they're including nuclear practitioners in their task groups to ensure that the revised general recommendations can be practically implemented and do not negatively and unnecessarily impact our bigger objective of meeting the COP28 sustainability goals.
Thank you so much, Joseph. And I would like, for the second topic on how to make better decision at very low dose exposure, I have some question for you, Roger and Thierry. Maybe I will start with you, Roger. In your presentation, you raised some industry concerns regarding the adoption of the LNT model. Could you please clarify these concerns? And regarding the adoption of the holistic approach addressed in the Thierry presentation as a challenge, what do you think the best way to be addressed in the next ICRP general recommendations? Roger.
Thank you. Yeah. Hi, Sami. Sorry, the first point was?
The first point is related to the adoption of the LNT model. Could you please elaborate and clarify the industry concerns regarding adoption of this model?
Yeah, sure. The issue to me is certainly at very low doses. If we rely too heavily on the LNT hypothesis, well, it's not a hypothesis, it's a model on which the system of protection is based. But if we purely rely on that, it leads us into this thing about there is no safe level of radiation. And I think as a profession, we have to be more honest when we're talking about risks at very low doses and recognize what we know and how our known risks, whatever they may be at very low levels, are no larger than things with risks that are commonly accepted in society. We need to, in discussing risk, we need to make more use of this comparison with natural background and indeed its variability. And that actually begs one question, if I may. This is back to Thierry, who noted in his presentation that there may not be a universally defined trivial risk. But my challenge would be but would ICRP consider something like 2 days exposure in Cornwall to be a trivial dose? Can we agree on what might be a trivial dose? And this is sort of well within the variability of natural background. So let's make more use of this comparison with natural background as a context for discussing risk, not as a justification for all low dose exposures. It's purely to give a more real life context, because we're all used to living in this variable radiation environment.
Thanks, Roger. Would you like to comment on this, Thierry?
Yeah, thank you for pointing this specific point. In fact, my message is there is no universal value of trivial risk, because then if you go into this direction, then it means that we consider that the safe level is independent from the situation. So in fact, the key point with regard to adopting the LNT model, we use the value of prudence, the ethical value of prudence, and then, of course, prudence doesn't mean that we need to reach zero level of exposure. But then we need to consider, according to the specific circumstances, according to the situation, what could be considered as acceptable situation, but depending on the specific circumstances. And then I agree with you that being exposed to natural radiation during today, this is not an issue, but this is because you discuss about natural radiation. When you discuss other situations, then you may have a different conclusion in different direction. If we consider the exposure in the mountain, in high level of altitude, then we may have higher exposure. But then, due to the situation, that could be the situation could be accepted. But the risk in itself is not something need to be accepted without considering the specific situation.
Thank you so much, Thierry. And I would like to move to the third topic. We have some questions regarding the views of the upcoming changes in the dose and dose rate effectiveness factor. I will start with you, Dominique. Based on your presentation, it seems like the likely range of the dose rate effectiveness factor and the low dose effectiveness factor is between 1 and 3. And hence, would you confirm, is it possible that ICRP could continue with the equivalent value of the dose and dose rate effectiveness factor around of 2?
Clearly, the value of 2 is still in the range of the review that has been performed by TG91. After that, as has been said by Werner before, clearly the decision on how to manage that, what is the value that has to be used, has to be considered with all the different other task groups. We have to take into account what we know about the variation between cancer sites. Clearly, the dose and dose rate effectiveness factor is one parameter in the calculation of the detriment for cancer, but there are many others. The choice of the baseline rates. So clearly, that's one piece, and that's a very important one. And the review that has been performed is clearly very interesting about that. Clearly, the value is still in a range between 1 and 3. This range is much smaller than what we had when those and dose rate effectiveness factors has been implemented in the system. At that time, again, we had values of several tenths between 1 and 20 and maybe more. So clearly, it seems that the new during the last 20 years, we have a lot of new information. For example, we have studies, epidemiological studies from nuclear workers that were not existing when the dose and dose rate effectiveness factor have been implemented in the 90s. So considering it, we have a new range, and the value of 2 is still in. We have that's a piece of information, but the choice is not done yet, and it has to be integrated with the results of the other task groups.
Thank you very much, Dominique. And there is a question also to Masanori Kitahara. In your conclusions, you suggested that ICRP to get engaged, or maybe should conduct kind of impact assessment for its upcoming guidance and general recommendation. In your opinion, what do you think the best way to do this, and how the industry and other stakeholders can support ICRP in this direction?
Thank you, Same. The specific sessions will be organized upcoming ICRP symposium and workshop and conference to discuss the progress of ICRP task group work, as well as the impact of ICRP task group reports and upcoming ICRP general recommendations. Thank you.
Thank you, Masanori. So like your suggestion, to organize a specific session with the upcoming meetings for the ICRP, and also for the upcoming ICRP symposium to address this challenge. Thank you so much. And we have just the last 2 questions, for the last topic on the role of ICRP and the system of radiation protection in the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. I would like to ask you, Werner, regarding in your presentation, you have provided a great examples to explain how ICRP and the radiation protection system play an important role in achieving United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And you provided some examples for that. In your opinion, do you think that the radiation protection system is also could have a key role in achieving other sustainable development goals, such as affordable and clean energy, industry innovations and infrastructure, and the climate actions? And how do you think the ICRP and the system of protection can contribute to achieve these goals? And secondly, questions to you as well, how do you think the system of protections could be aligned to these goals, and what are the area of the systems do you feel needs to be improved to deliver sustainable outcomes?
Well, thank you, Sami. I just want to stress again that what I gave in my presentation were just examples. I just gave 4 or 5 examples how the system of radiation protection can contribute towards some of those SDGs. But there are many more examples. And you mentioned a number of others where we can probably contribute. As for clean energy, I guess you have in mind nuclear energy, for example. We have addressed this issue in the paper itself, saying that we acknowledge that many ways to produce energy are associated with radioactivity or radiation. That's not just nuclear energy. There are other forms of energy where you have also nuclear ionizing radiation involved. And it's our job, ICRP, to protect anyone from radiation, regardless where the radiation comes from. But clearly, I mean, we contribute in radiation protection to many other SDGs. Just a few examples I gave. The other way around, how sustainability could inform the system. How could we improve the system to make sure that sustainability is a major or an important element of the system? This is, at least to me, not yet clear at all. I mean, this is something we should discuss together and collect ideas together. There might be the the idea or the possibility to include it in the optimization process, that we have another element of sustainability there, in addition, explicitly maybe, or in justification, the same. So currently we have a number of task groups thinking about where the SDGs specifically, or in more general, the idea of sustainable development could inform and improve, enhance the system of radiation protection. This is currently ongoing work. And I think such events like the webinar today helps ICRP to come up with ideas towards this direction.
Thank you very much, Werner. The same question to you, Pete. From the industrial perspective, what do you think the areas of the system do you feel that need to be improved to deliver sustainable outcomes, and especially to this, the same sustainable development goals that Werner explained?
So I think it's all about making sure that whatever we do in the system of protection point of view enables sustainable outcomes still. So I'll give you an example. As we see more and more new advanced nuclear technologies coming out, there's also much greater emphasis on using cogeneration. So that, for instance, might be generating hydrogen from waste heat, or generating carbon capture systems from waste heat, or even district heating as well. What we want to ensure is that radiation is treated as one of a number of considerations in deploying those technologies, and it doesn't unduly limit those abilities for them to be deployed, leading to non-sustainable outcomes. So an example would be around emergency planning. Do we need to evolve consideration about what values are an acceptable level from an emergency point of view that could preclude the deployment of these technologies for much greater social and sustainable outcomes? And similarly, on the materials point of view, I think materials is a really important piece here, because if we look at what happens in the mining sector, along with other parts of the nuclear industry, we end up throwing away huge quantities of materials which are usable, which don't actually have any real health or risk associated with them, based on criteria that have been adopted in domestic regulation on that basis. So for me, a big chunk of this isn't necessarily aligning the system of protection against an SDG and saying we're already doing something about it. It's about the outcomes of what we do in day-to-day decision making being sustainable outcomes. So that could mean we might accept reuse of materials with much higher doses, but have much greater societal benefit for reuse. So it's not a simple answer, but I'll come back to the kind of concluding parts of my slides. There are a couple of areas there that we explored, which were highlighted as key risk areas.
Thank you very much, Pete, and also thank you for all panelists and speakers for very interesting discussions and very great contributions to the webinar. And I would like also to thank all the webinar attendees. And if you have also further specific questions to the speakers, feel free to contact them directly or can address me as well. Please note that all presentations given today will be available later for the public with a record of the webinar on the ICRP website. Now I will hand over to Sama and Werner to provide closing remarks. And over to you, Sama.
Thank you very much, Same. Well, I want to maybe start by thanking all the speakers, all the panelists, and of course, all the panelists for participating. Thank you, Same, for moderating the discussion and making us mostly on time. So thank you for that. I think maybe very briefly, I will highlight some of the things that I've found very interesting in our discussion. You know, obviously the context of everything that we are discussing is sustainability. And I think this was defined by, I think it was Peter, or perhaps it was Werner who described this. How do we meet the needs of today while we ensure that future generations will have the opportunity to meet their own needs? So that's the definition of sustainability. But I think that sometimes we forget that this has several dimensions, and perhaps I want to highlight two that I think are relevant in today's discussions context. You know, many times in advanced economies, when we are thinking about sustainability, we often focus on environmental sustainability, we focus on optimizing energy use, and we focus on perhaps decarbonization and pollution control, which is obviously very important, and we really need to continue focusing on that. But we should not forget that there is also, when we look at sustainability from the point of view of developing countries, we have quite different priorities. So when we are looking from the point of view of developing economies, they are not looking at decarbonizing, they are looking at energizing. They are looking at increasing their prosperity. They are looking at socio-economic development. They are looking at having access to health, education, clean water, nutritious food. So to me, those are a little bit different needs, different priorities that really change a little bit how we really need to look at sustainability. The concept of sustainability is really, really a little bit broader. So this is why I think it's very important that when we look at regulation and when we look at things such as, for example, the system of radiological protection, we really balance out the obvious need to minimize or to limit any detrimental health effects for ionizing radiation, with limiting the obvious benefits that using all these technologies is going to have for society as a whole. So, I mean, I truly think that we, the practitioners of all these technologies, the experts in radiological protection, and the experts that may be able to make all these technologies available, whether it's nuclear energy or nuclear medicine or some other very important life-saving technologies, I think that we will be judged very harshly by future generations if we don't really do our best to make sure that these incredibly important technologies are going to be available for sure today, but also in the future in a way that is certainly safe, but also that we can extract the maximum benefits from these technologies. Then the second thing that I will say, which is I think just as important, that has been said very many times, that this whole thing is a team effort. All the conversations, all the goals, all the ambitious things that we all want to achieve cannot be done by one single organization. So we really need to continue the collaboration. We need to continue the conversations. I mean, and this is one of the reasons why World Nuclear Association, we created what we call the Cooperation Forum for Nuclear Technology Associations, where we exchange information within practitioners, obviously from the nuclear energy industry, but also from many other industries that use ionizing radiation. Obviously, nuclear medicine, other irradiation technologies, the non-destructive testing industry, the industries that use radioisotopes for environmental protection or industrial applications. So I think it's very important that we continue the conversation so we all really carry forward our shared responsibility to make the most of really these very essential technologies moving forward in a sustainable manner. So let me just close by thanking everybody on behalf of World Nuclear Association. I in particular want to thank, of course, to ICRP for this fabulous cooperation and this very good collaborative work that we have done organizing this joint webinar. And we are really thrilled about the very large attendance. So I think that was, as I said, the conversation was very interesting. And for your information, World Nuclear Association will provide a written summary of the discussions after the webinar is concluded. Of course, this will be shared with the ICRP and it will be made available to everybody at the ICRP website and of course at the World Nuclear Association website. So the goal here is to generate useful input and constructive discussions in the process of the radiological protection systems review that the ICRP has started. Okay, so with this, I want to thank all of you, and I will hand over to Werner so he can provide the ICRP closing remarks. Thank you again for the opportunity to join all of you today.
Thank you very much, Sama. Yeah, let me just emphasize one thing you just said, Sama, that sustainability or sustainable development is a broad concept. It's a complicated concept, and this is already reflected by the fact that the United Nations needed to formulate 17 goals, 17, not just one, but 17. It's not just climate change, fighting climate change. It's not just producing clean energy. It's not fighting against poverty. So there are many goals which we have to address if we want to support sustainable development of our planet. And we should keep this in mind. It's a complicated issue. And that's why I fully support what you just said, that we should do that together, because each organization can contribute and feed in their own experience and their own views. And it's only together, if we work together, that we can maybe address this complicated topic. Now, to me, as I mentioned, ICRP is really keen on working together with other organizations to do that together. And to me, the key question is, in terms of sustainability, is the system of radiological protection already robust or fit enough that sustainability is sufficiently included, the system? And the second question is the other way around, or is it more the application, the implementation of the system into practical, into basic safety standards, for example, of the agency, where we should consider a sustainable outcome, support sustainable outcome, or is it both? For me, for the moment, I think it's both. I think the system works pretty well, and we saw one example how nuclear industry reduced annual occupational effective doses from, what was it, 4 millisievert per year down to 1 or even below millisievert per year, which reaches the natural background level. So the system works, yes, but can we do more? That's my first question. And this is what we can do as ICRP, because we are currently reviewing the system. And that's why we need input. And the other question is it just the application of the system? How it's transposed into national legislation, for example. Is this the problem? How the system is interpreted? So this we have to elaborate further, I think, jointly together with many other actors. But I already got my first ideas on that. And this was really nice, this webinar, because of that. So finally, let me close and echo what Sama just said. I would like to thank you all. I would like to thank the speakers for their time, for their efforts. I would like to thank all the listeners, all those who participated, who listened, wherever you are, maybe in the morning, in the afternoon, in the evening, or even at night. Please join us again on the next webinars. ICRP is continuously organizing more and more webinars on other issues as well. We heard one or two were together with WNA recently, but we have other organizations as well on other topics. So I would like to thank you all for coming, and I hope that we can see you again at our next webinar. Thank you very much for joining, and thank you very much for all those who helped us organizing this meeting. Bye-bye.